Welcome, everybody. Good evening from here in the Northeast to wherever you are. We very much appreciate you joining us today. We believe that we have an outstanding educational opportunity for you, and we're very proud of that. My name is Dr. Steve Saffier. I'm the interim program director of the Masters in Human Capital Management program at Columbia University in the School of Professional Studies. We are a group of talented, committed students, wonderful, experienced scholar practitioners as faculty, and a collaborative, expert administrative team that brings education to our students. And at times, we'd like to share that with the community and bring together thought leaders and people like yourselves to share an experience and learn. And we think tonight, and I'm sure you'll each agree with us, is a very important topic that we will get into as I introduce my colleagues. Just by way of background, this is a fifth event that we've run out of the program. We had back in October, coming off a summer of COVID and issues of racial justice, we had a program called the Summer of 2020, where we gathered HR leaders to talk about what it was like to lead organizations and support people through the past summer. We had a conversation with chief diversity officers moderated by one of our faculty members, Dr. Cindy Pace, who's the global diversity officer at MetLife. We had an event called Breaking Down the Walls. How do we use human capital analytics to think more strategically across human capital management to support organizations? And then most recently, as part of a series at our school, Frame Your Future, Game Time Decision-Making in Times of Disruption, where again, we had a stellar panel. Tonight, we're going to talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism, and ask ourselves, has anything changed? What's different about today? And I'm going to turn the panel over in a moment, but first, I'd like to introduce you to Jen Goes. Jennifer is our faculty committee DEI expert, among others, leader of our working committee subgroup across the school, senior director of faculty recruiting and faculty communications, doing her dissertation on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we thought if there was someone that we could put up to field your questions, we thought that Jen would be just the right person to do it. So we encourage you to submit questions during the panel. Jen will be reading them and forwarding them to our panelists for discussion. So Jen, thanks very much for joining us. And it's great to have a real pro on the line for us. So thanks. And yeah, as you know, we have a great time working together on behalf of the students. Well, let's start then. Perhaps we can ask the panelists to introduce themselves as Edna is coming on board. So Katie, if you'd start, if you could give us a couple of minutes on who you are, what you do, and frankly, why you're here.
Thank you. It's a real honor to be here with all of you. I am Katie Duchek. In my career, I am the Executive Vice President of Personal Commercial Banking at RBC in Canada. I have responsibility for all of our frontline employees in Canada, which represents about 25,000 employees, from commercial bankers to call center reps and tellers in branches. So quite a spectrum of individuals. I also lead distribution strategy and how digitization is affecting those jobs and those workers. Obviously, diversity is a fact, and Canada, like many parts of the US, has rapidly shifting diversity dimensions across the population, given immigration, etc. I think what's probably equally important is, personally, while I appear to be a typical white blonde, I am a woman with gender transition experience. I came out to 80,000 employees and 25,000 under my leadership on June 17th, 2019. I promised myself I would face my truth while retaining my job. I'm proud to say I am still in my role. I love my role. I have been met with the kindest of humanity on my journey. And I have also been met, because of my role leading so many people, I've been the beneficiary. Because of my vulnerability, I've had thousands of people open up to me about their hurt, their hardship, whether they're from the Black community, the women's community, the LGBT community, whether they've got a post-war trauma newcomer story, Indigenous stories, etc. So I feel quite privileged to be who I am after many years of life. I feel quite privileged to be able to keep the job that I worked so hard for. And I feel quite privileged to have the trust of so many people that have opened up to me. So it's an honor to be here. So I will bring a business leader lens, and I will also bring, my own human experience lens to the conversation today.
Katie, thank you, and very much appreciate that you're here, and we welcome you, and thank you for sharing that with us. 25,000 people sounds like a lot to lead, but sure it is. Welcome. Frank, perhaps you'd go next. Let's go over to the world of higher education.
I'm so sorry. I just had a computer freeze in the middle of this. So.
Welcome back, Edna. Good to have
I'm
you.
back.
She's back.
All things to happen.
So Edna, we've introduced Katie. I don't know if you were able to hear
wonderful.
that. And Frank now is going to introduce himself.
Thank you.
Good evening, friends. So I'm Frank Wu, president of Queens College, part of the City University of New York, and I started in the midst of the pandemic just last summer. Like many of our students at CUNY, the 20,000 or so who are enrolled and taking classes virtually now, I'm the child of newcomers. Although I was born here in the United States, my parents came from China via Taiwan in the early 1960s. So I understand what it's like to have that awkward role reversal where as a kid you have to be an interpreter to your elders. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan, the Motor City, and I'll talk a little bit more about what it was like there in the American Midwest in the 70s when you were expected to meet an impossible standard set by your social superiors. I'll just add that with the events of Atlanta just a few weeks ago, suddenly everyone is aware of Asian Americans and that we are here. For Asian Americans, those of us working on these issues, the awareness is new and we're grateful, but the issues are not. They've always been here. It's just that they're undeniable now. When people watch the viral videos of senior citizens shoved to the ground with such force that they break bones and have concussions while bystanders do nothing, these attacks are not random, they're racial. As we bring Asian Americans into the picture, though, my hope is that we recognize a historic struggle for Black equality, which provided benefits to all of us. All too often, when people who are neither Black nor white are introduced into this picture, it's for divisive purposes rather than to build bridges. And that's what I hope we'll talk about, how we can form coalitions to realize ideals that we all profess. It isn't just rights for this group or that group, it's a set of universal principles, though the experiences are different. And by sharing those stories, we can come to see both the common cause we share and the privileges that some of us enjoy that are denied to others. So I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Dr. Farmer, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Good day, everyone. I'm Dr. Jennifer Farmer. I'm currently the Vice President of Global Diversity and Inclusion at Thermo Fisher Scientific. I've actually been with the company about 6 months now, so still fairly new. But I will say, very excited to be with Thermo Fisher Scientific. There's a lot of enthusiasm around diversity, inclusion, and equity right now. So that makes my job a little easier. But currently, as an organization, we are focused on really 3 key pillars. One around fostering organizational culture, ensuring that every single employee across this company is able to thrive in this environment, regardless of race, gender, sexual orientation, veteran status, disability status. And so we put a lot of emphasis on really creating that environment where everyone can thrive. The second pillar is around really reinforcing our infrastructure. And so we're spending a lot of time really looking at our systems, our tools, our resources, ensuring that we are de-biasing those systems and tools and making it equitable for everyone. And then lastly, focusing on accountability, ensuring that everyone in the company, whether they're an individual contributor, middle manager, or senior leader, has responsibility for diversity and inclusion. So it is an exciting time, and I'm very excited to be a part of this panel this evening.
Thank you. And Mr. Mulman, can you introduce yourself?
Sure, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, great. James Mulman, Chief Equity Officer at 3M. I've been in this role. We've got a couple of new folks starting jobs during the pandemic. I am one as well. So I've been with the company for just about 4.5 months. You know, my career has mostly been in the HR function. So I've served in a DEI leadership capacity at my previous employer, General Mills, for the better part of the last 4 years as well. So this space is near and dear to my heart. But you know, more personally, my home is 20 minutes away from the Cup Foods where George Floyd was tragically murdered last summer. And so I think as we talk about this work and the moment that we are operating in and the opportunity that's in front of us to drive real lasting change, you know, I live and feel that every day being in the backdrop of the Twin Cities here in Minnesota. So looking forward to the conversation, and thanks for having me.
Thank you. And Dr. Sellers, will you introduce yourself?
Yes. Good evening, everyone. My name is Robert Sellers. I'm the Vice Provost and Chief Diversity Officer at the University of Michigan. I'm also a professor of psychology. I've been at the University of Michigan now as a Vice Provost and Chief Diversity Officer for 7 years, at the university for 24 years. I think the thing that I hope to bring to the conversation is really thinking about the role that our current zeitgeist plays in diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education. Higher education being a key system, both as a potential mitigator of much of our societal inequalities, but absolutely a perpetrator as well. And so we have been on a journey at the University of Michigan. We are completing a 5-year diversity, equity, and inclusion strategic plan, which has as its goal simply long-term systemic change in which we become a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive community for all. So I look forward to the conversation, and thank you.
Thank you so much. I think Jen Goez was already introduced. Is that correct? Great, wonderful. So we have an extraordinary panel here who have many perspectives to share on these issues, which are extremely timely right now. We know, as James Mulman mentioned, what's going on in Minneapolis. We know about the Black Lives Matter protests. We know that the nation is really at a crucial point in its history. And so the question arises, is anything different about the environment today that makes us believe that sustainable change in diversity, equity, inclusion is possible, that we can actually make progress? And if so, what conditions are necessary for us to do this? And we'll just kind of do this openly, so please just chime in and we'll do this as a conversation since you've all introduced yourselves.
So I'll jump in, Etna. So I think the short answer is yes. I think it is possible. I think with the George Floyd incident, as horrible as it was, it really was a wake-up call for us. It was a wake-up call for many of us across this nation, across the world, for many corporations, and we've seen the response to that over the last year or so. I think there's something uniquely different about seeing someone lose their life on film, and then also seeing that again and again and again on television and on social media outlets. So I think that hits home for a lot of people. And now we have an environment where everyone wants to do something about it. Everyone wants to be a part of the solution, where most people do. And so we've seen that the huge response from many corporations. My corporation is included in that in terms of really trying to help with this issue of racial equity, social injustice. And so I think it is possible, but there are some key components that I think we have to think about. It's not going to happen overnight. And for those of us who have been a part of this profession for many years, we know that it takes a while. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes leadership commitment, it takes resources, both financial and human. It takes accountability. And so all of those things working together will help us to get to where I think we need to be. But it has to be a constant focus on that. And it's not something that will happen overnight. It can't be the flavor of the month. And so we have to put the true time and effort into this, but also bringing our leaders along in this process and really getting to a point where we're embedding it into every single thing that we do so that it becomes a way of life. It becomes a part of our culture. And I think when we can do that, we can get to some sense of sustainability, but it will take hard time.
Definitely take time. But what are the conditions that are different now that make it possible? Because we know how often we've gone backward. We've gone backward many times.
Yeah, there's multiple, and I think that's what makes this whole topic exciting and historic. One is Obama called it out himself, and he said, look at these riots. There are people in these riots from all walks of life. And if you go back to Stonewall and different riots of the past, it was an individual group trying to fight for their well-being. Whereas this time, what you saw was people from all walks of life. And then as Jennifer said, it was powered by social media, which gathered momentum and attention. But the other things that are different is there's an abundance now of scientific research that points to the fact that if a human being is marginalized through overt or microaggressions over time, their belief in self, their psychological strength is eroded. There's also scientific research that shows that lack of inclusion in a position of authority or power also becomes a more pronounced issue. So the scientific research is there today to prove the fact that there is lost human potential because people have been marginalized. Human beings have been marginalized. And then I think the last force of change is you've now got the World Economic Forum and other organizations starting to stand up for sustainability. Not just climate sustainability or environmental sustainability, they're also standing up for social sustainability. And the root cause of social sustainability is social divide and the marginalization of human beings as social divide gets further and further apart. So ESG on the social side is all about social and income equality and opportunity. So there's a lot more factors that play today than I've experienced at any point in my 35-year career.
So how do we deal, though, with the backlash? The backlash is there. We're feeling it. There are people who don't want to hear this. There are people on the other side. How do we deal with that?
So I'm going to do what law professors do, on the one hand, on the other hand, and offer a negative and then a positive, try to synthesize that. So here's the negative. Like many of you, I've been doing talks like this for 25 years. And I'm going to take back something that I've said. If you listen to anything I said maybe 5 years ago, I was saying, well, we've seen a real decline, at least in public life among leaders, in overt, egregious, in-your-face, self-proclaimed, unashamed white supremacy and just raw bigotry, right? And I was doing talks about microaggression, implicit bias, that sort of thing. Here's the negative. In the past few years, a toxic environment has been created. Now, I'm not going to point fingers. I'll just say that there's been a rise again of meaning it's not my interpretation. It's people standing up and saying, I am a white supremacist, just openly declaring it, especially on social media, with a lot of fake news, and even if it's not in your feed, and we all get this in our own feed, right? Or we're trolled, it's in these other sites that we don't visit.
Right.
So it's come back. We've seen a rise of ethnic nationalism just around the world, and nobody is immune from it. No community. So that's the negative. Here's the positive. We now have a fragile consensus, right? That this is wrong, and we need to do something about it. So my father, who was born in China, grew up in Taiwan, came to the U.S. He and I, we don't really talk about that much, right? It's like a lot of fathers and sons. He's been watching the trial going on. And he's watched the video of Mr. George Floyd being killed. And my father said to me the other day, that was ridiculous. He said to me, what those police officers did, that was ridiculous. And I was astonished that my father was following this trial, but he's following it closely, and that he wanted to let me know how wrong he thought it was that this man was killed in broad daylight and heroic citizen journalists captured it. That to me is a sign of change. It's just a small personal example. All right, so how do we put together? Briefly, it's a process, not an outcome. Diversity is like democracy. In talks like this, someone always asks, how do we fix it? How do we get there? What's the solution? There isn't one. I say that as an optimist, not a pessimist. Democracy is something we participate in. Maybe diversity is the same. It's a process. It demands our engagement and constant effort. And if we don't see that, we'll be disillusioned.
Go ahead, Sellers.
So one of the things that makes me less optimistic about the future is, so yes, things have changed and things always change, and yet things are always the same. And one of my concerns is, and it's sort of reflective in our conversation, is we tend to think about racism in terms of interpersonal terms, in terms of how people feel about each other. And this is coming from a psychologist who has spent his entire career studying racial discrimination, racial identity, microaggressions, et cetera, at the personal and interpersonal level and its impact on people's lives. But the reality is, until we start dealing with structural inequality, structural oppression, structural racism, it doesn't really matter in terms of how any individuals or sets of individuals' attitudes change and move. And one of the things that I worry most about in terms of being pessimistic is that we will spend more of our efforts addressing the intrapersonal and interpersonal issues, and less of our efforts on addressing fundamental inequalities that may actually be fundamental to our society, and how they play out across race and other groups in particular. But as we talk about the American society in particular, the unique understanding and notion of race and what race actually means and how it impacts our broader society. And so while the optimistic side of me feels like at least there's certain kinds of efforts that are going in place that are attempting to address structure, our big picture focus, I'm always worried will be co-opted back to how one person feels about another, and that being the definition of racist. So a person becomes racist if they're wearing a hood or espousing a particular racist trope, but letting all of the rest of us off the hook if we are participating in structures that are by definition racist without actually engaging and making those changes.
And so that's a really important point. I want to mention also that even the phrase systemic racism, 10 years ago, if you said that in higher education, you would be thrown out of the room. And now, maybe it's because what Frank Wu said, we've heard about white supremacy coming up. We're now able to at least use that term where I hear it said by politicians for the first time people are acknowledging that this is a phenomenon, that it is, as Professor Sellers has said, systemic to our society. It is structural. It's reproduced in our institutions and organizations. And I'm wondering, for example, James Bauman, being in Minneapolis and at the forefront of what's going on, how has that affected the day-to-day interactions, the conversations around the water cooler in your organization?
Yeah, I was gonna actually, you gave me a nice segue to what I was actually gonna share, which is, look, I think what's changed for me in the last 8-9 months since the George Floyd tragedy is I think, especially in a place like Minnesota, we have a term here that we affectionately call Minnesota nice, which is this kind of very Midwestern surfacey level congeniality to all topics, and especially topics that are uncomfortable. And what I think happened last May is we were able to break through that to a real honest conversation about real issues, and the language, to the point you referenced around systemic racism, anti-racism, the language that we use, the honesty and the transparency by which we're talking about these issues has changed. Again, I think for many years we've talked about disparities, but haven't gotten to the heart of why those disparities exist. And today we're talking about systems change and the systemic racism that gets in the way of addressing, we have, in the state of Minnesota, we have some of the worst racial disparities in the country. Now we've known that for years and years. The conversation we're having around the why is different now. And so I do think I am optimistic because the conversation's more honest and more real. The leaders that are participating in those conversations are more courageous in the actions they're willing to take. But this is going to be a long game. Again, I think as I lead the work in my organization, as my colleagues and peers at other companies here in the Twin Cities do their work, we know there's no simple and short-term fixes to this work. And that's actually, I think, the challenge for a lot of diversity and inclusion professionals is how do we keep folks' attention and engagement, because George Floyd will become a distant memory not too far from now. And the energy, the enthusiasm, and the commitment that we've seen, how will we sustain it? So that's what gives me a little cautious optimism, but optimism nonetheless.
So
I want to build on James's point. Contrast a little bit to Frank and Robert. I would be on the cup half full. I've come through a personal journey where I was ready to take my life because I thought the world would reject me. And what I saw on the other side was the complete opposite of what I expected, immense levels of kindness and openness. And so first I learned to come at this through the Declaration of Human Rights, which is we are all born free and equal, and equal in terms of our rights to dignity, respect, equality, etc., which I fundamentally believe as a human being. If you look at diversity through that lens, diversity is just a fact. Human beings are either born with or experience traumas that are visible or invisible, visible or invisible. It's harder when it's visible. There is no question, because you could be judged by a distance. But the common thread is most of us in humanity have invisible or visible dimensions of human uniqueness. And the common thread that cuts across all of us is fear of judgment, fear of rejection, fear of being marginalized, fear of not being good enough, self-hate, self-loathing. Those things are true. The good side, that's just the fact. The good side of the equation is, on the factual side, diversity of the planet, we will not slow it down. Individual nation states can close their borders to immigration for periods of time, but the reality is immigration will continue. The reality is our children will marry people that they love, not necessarily the people that we point them to. Our children, there's a survey that I saw last year that said of young people today, it was a marketing research survey, 50% of young people consider themselves LGBTQ+, somewhere on the spectrum of gender, somewhere on the spectrum of sexual orientation. That's our young people. My children were not brought into this world with the level of judgment and bias that we were. And so longer term, our young people, I believe, will grow up to be more socially aware and inclusive human beings. I believe there will be a natural mixing and blending of human beings. And I believe where I'm negative with Robert is politicians only come in for 4 years. And they go left and they go right, especially in the US. And that creates divisiveness over time. And so, but policymakers are politicians. We need them to deal with structural issues for women, for the Black community, for the Indigenous community, etc. But ultimately, I think the sustainable change is going to come from one, young people, and 2, CEOs that believe, that know and believe that there is massive lost opportunity in their customer base and in their employee base by lack of participation, lack of social and economic inclusion. And I see it. I see it with the CEOs of IBM, the CEOs of Microsoft, the CEOs of my company, that has shifted.
So, this jumps to, we've identified the problem, the landscape, so to speak. And I'm going to sort of mix up here the questions that we were thinking about. So we know that we have different views about the progress we're making. Some are more optimistic, some are more pessimistic, some are in the middle. We know that generational change is underway and that there's some hope there too, with younger generations who are more open to diversity. And we don't define diversity narrowly just in terms of race. We know it involves gender. We know it involves sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, generational issues. So I don't want it just to be focused on race, because it is all of those things and it is intersectional. You have women of color, you have women who are gay, etc. So in thinking about that broad platform and the companies and institutions you work in, tell us about one program that you feel really good about, that you have been able to implement in your environment, a diversity intervention program that you think has made a difference.
So I'll jump in on a couple of fronts. So in terms of a program that, well, let me take it writ large. So I had mentioned that we are in the midst of our 5-year DEI strategic plan. And this was the very first strategic plan that our institution had. It's a relatively, well, it was initially a relatively unique approach to it. And the goal was to link diversity, equity, and inclusion at an institution of higher education that is, while public, also has a fairly elite mission and vision of itself in the context of the higher education world. And our goal was to link diversity, equity, and inclusion to first make it a core value of the institution, which it had not been, and then move it from being a core value to being a standard operating procedure for every aspect, whether it was admissions and recruitment of students, to hiring faculty, to supporting staff, to our work in the community, and across all of these and many more efforts, you found significant, and we still have a long way to go, inequities across race, inequities that are related to class, inequities that are related to sexual identity, gender, you name it. The inequities can be found, and they have in many cases been systemic. You layer on top of that inequities with regards to experiences that individuals had as a function of their interactions on an interpersonal level. So in our efforts, in our 5 years, just by having the strategic plan and having it the way that it's been set up, we've been able to make DEI be a central part of how the university operates. So whether it's in making decisions about how to address COVID, with the DEI being a core value of every one of the committees as part of the committee's charge to make sure that whatever efforts we came up to mitigate and decide how we were going to move forward, that DEI was a part of. Making sure that DEI is a core part of the budget process, that as the fundamental process within the institution, a very decentralized institution, it was important to link that to perhaps the most important process there, to make sure that it's implemented in the curricula, in the products that we as an institution provide. These have, this strategic plan, and it doesn't really matter the content of the plan, but the fact that we have made it matter throughout the institution is perhaps the intervention for which I am most proud. And within that, there are 2,800 different action items that have been put forward, a number of exciting plans from K through, or I'm sorry, 7th through 12th grade outreach, leading to scholarship opportunities related to class, related to underrepresented services, initiatives to provide access around ability status across the board. But it was the linking of diversity to our core mission as an institution, not as an add-on, not as the morally right thing to do, but as the core mission, linking it to, in our case, academic excellence, and having it be no longer a contested idea, but the core value of the institution.
Absolutely. It is one of the best plans in the US today. I know that for sure. And it's a remarkable plan that I know our students have looked at and are really impressed with. Other panelists, what are some of the other programs that you've implemented that have been successful embedding DE&I in the DNA of your institution or your corporation?
And just very quickly, there is a good question from our audience, so I can, if maybe we can jump in now with a question. So relating to DEI, anti-racism, and systemic oppression, what approaches should individuals and organizations take to denounce white supremacy? If individuals and organizations don't want to denounce white supremacy or remain neutral, how does that enable/foster racism and systemic oppression?
It's Katie. It's a powerful question. I have this discussion with my senior leadership team every time something terrible happens. And so whether it was Black Lives Matter and George Floyd, or whether it was the recent issues in the Asian community, whether it's the annual, there was a business school or a school in Canada, McGill, where several women engineering students were murdered a long time ago. Like, you literally have to encourage all leaders to stand up with their voice every time something happens. Because as much as you think, well, the CEO said something, so I don't need to. The reality is we are all being observed and judged by thousands of employees and or customers. And so if you don't stand up and make statements about the appalling side of exclusionary behavior, and standing up for inclusive behavior and equity, you leave it open for your clients or your employees to wonder about where you stand on the issue. So we need louder voices, especially from leaders, repeatedly whenever something goes wrong. I do like the reference to systemic oppression. I think if you took a pyramid of, you know, women's rights issues, LGBT rights issues, which can be broken up, the Black community, the newcomer community, the Indigenous community, I ultimately believe the chronic issue is systemic bias or systemic oppression. So I really appreciate that. And the reality is we just have to stand up against it. And I think the more inclusive we are, the more of humanity will see, oh, it's not about making this community the favorite of the month. It's about standing up against oppression.
Yes, and we absolutely have to do that. But I know in higher education, it's been sort of off and on that way. You know, when something happens, sometimes presidents will come out and sometimes they won't. Sometimes they won't name it. Sometimes they won't talk about the target group. The George Floyd incident, there was a study done of 130 college statements, college president statements, in which 25% of them never named a target group. And many of them never actually named the actual incident. So it varies widely. I'm wondering, Frank, you have a tremendous experience in higher education. What has been your experience with naming white supremacy in higher education? Is that something that's done?
It's done sometimes, but it's necessary but not sufficient. You know, I want to be clear so no one misunderstands me. We have to stand up. We have to speak out. We have to be good allies. And there's so many statements that college presidents make. I'm probably guilty of this as well, that are just platitudes. You know, they're abstractions, they're aspirational. And at the end, you think, what was that person talking about, right? Because they don't name who the perpetrator is, they don't name who the victim was, it's written by a committee, and it's just generic and it's meaningless. And I try as much as I can to not make statements like that because they're just not useful. You know, it's like last summer, I can't tell you how many companies, how many nonprofits, how many universities sent me messages, we stand with Black Lives Matter. And then they would get called out on social media by their employees. No, you don't, right? And that is not what we need more of. So there are two other things we need to do. One of them is to address the harder parts of this, which is what's ambiguous, what we're ambivalent about, what's complicated, what's structural, what's subtle, where it's not just the in-your-face stuff. Here's an example. When someone says to an African American, "You're so articulate," or to an Asian American, "My, you speak English so well," right? That is still said to me. And to tell you the truth, I do not respond to people by saying, "You're a bigot," because that's not actually useful. That doesn't advance the dialogue. But what they're really saying is they have an image in their head and you don't conform to it, right? And their image is negative and they've accidentally sort of blurred that out in the guise of a compliment. So it requires something much more difficult to engage with that person. The second thing that we have to do, and here I'm going to say something that's controversial. If others disagree, please feel free to. There are also white folks, some Asian as well, and people of all backgrounds who they don't believe that they are villains. They're not white supremacists, but they feel a vague sense of threat because of a loss of privilege, right? And how do we win people like that over so that they're not pushed the other way? And I just present that as a challenge. I don't have a good response, but you know, I'm always looking to build bridges and to reach out and to say, these are the ideals that you claim to have as well. That's what Dr. King did in his letter from a Birmingham jail. He said to white clergy, "You preach from the pulpit the same message, now live up to it," right? So as a lawyer, I'm always asking, what advocacy will win people over? So I pose it as a question, not an answer.
So in that vein, just wondering, of going back to the idea of diversity intervention, James Millman, have you had success at 3M with organizational learning, with diversity education programs? I know you're fairly new there, but what are your thoughts about that? Can you really move a culture? Can you really make change in people's behaviors?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I have been here for only 4 months, so I don't have a lot of successes yet. But the one thing I do appreciate Frank's commentary on this whole notion of building bridges, because I am a big believer in building bridges. And one of the things that I did with my previous employer, and we're doing this at 3M as well, is I believe in allyship. We've heard that term a lot in the last 10 months or so. There is, especially in a community like this, which is, again, Minnesota is not the most diverse place in the world, but we have a really strong community of folks who want to be better, do better, know better, and act better. And I believe that allyship is a capability. There are some of us that it comes naturally, and there's some of us that need to develop that muscle. And I believe that we can provide education, empathy building experiences, immersions, and the like to allow people to be better allies. And so that's where we've invested a lot of our time and resource. 3M, for example, I mean, we're still a majority white organization. I've got a lot of folks who don't know how to engage in this conversation. And so how can I build their capability to be more equipped as managers and leaders to engage with their employees of color and not of color, to have these conversations? Because while we can make corporate statements, and again, I work with my CEO quite a bit on what are we going to say when X, Y, and Z happens. While those statements matter, what really matters is that your manager understands the experience that you're going through, the fear and the anxiety that you have. And when they don't have the courage to acknowledge your lived experience, that hurts more than 3M or whatever company makes whatever statement. And so my work is to go small. I need every individual leader to be able to have these conversations, to be able to build bridges with their team and understand that everybody has a different lived experience. So again, while the macro is important, I believe the micro is too, and we can't ignore that. We need every employee in our organization to live those values and share that culture.
I love that emphasis on the middle of an organization. We've just been talking about that in our class. And, too often we're sort of at the ends of the spectrum was what we were talking about. And we fail to acknowledge the people in the middle. And one of the most important relationships is supervisor-employee. Jennifer, how have you dealt with education in thermoscientific? What has been successful for you in the educational process of your employees?
Thank you for the question. One of the things that we recognize is that, sometimes we assume that people understand, they know these concepts, and in many cases they don't. So first, I'd just like to kind of follow up on James's comment around really helping people to become allies. And I would say after the George Floyd incident, one of the things that we noticed is that we got a lot of emails and calls from employees saying, I want to hear from my leaders. I've heard from the CEO, but I want to hear from my business unit leader or my line leader. And so after doing a little digging, we found out that many of those leaders weren't having those conversations because they weren't equipped to have those conversations. And so sometimes we make the assumption that they know, but they really don't know. And so, and this was actually prior to me coming to Thermo Fisher at my last company, we spent a significant amount of time preparing our leaders to have those conversations because many of them said, I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to, offend someone. And so helping them understand privilege, helping them understand social injustice and racial injustice and what that means. And then also providing them tips and things that they can do to really have those difficult conversations. And so we actually took about 200 vice presidents through a training called Racial Injustice Stops With Me to really prepare them to have those conversations. And so we got really great feedback, but it was a lesson to us that, even though we have people that are very high up in corporations, they don't always know everything. And so as D&I leaders, we have to prepare them. So at Thermo Fisher, what we've done over the last 2 years is embedded some of those trainings within our ethics training, which is mandatory. for all of our employees. And we thought that was very important because there are some basic things that we feel every single employee should know. They should know that, again, everyone has a role in creating that inclusive environment that we want to see. And so we don't want a situation where people say, I didn't know, right? And so last year we embedded unconscious bias as a part of the ethics training. This year we have 2 modules around belonging as a part of the ethics training. And we're currently building our overall D&I education strategy to really address the different needs across the company. And one of the things that we will be focused on is creating those allies, because there are many leaders that will come to us and say, how can I help? How can I be a part of the solution? And again, we want to make sure that they have the tools to really do that effectively. So we'll be spending a lot of time on that this year.
That's fantastic.
Can I,
in terms of
can I
vocabulary.
build off of that,
and-
Edna?
Yes, go ahead.
I think Jennifer and James's points are really, really important. One, at the manager level, I think most of us, certainly I believe this in Canada, that we now need to operate on the basis that all managers will be allies. They may not be comfortable as allies today, but we have to teach them and prepare them to be allies. Like, I don't think you can be an inclusive leader without being an ally. It's a contradiction. So I think Frank's point about preparing managers and Jennifer's is critical. Ways to get at that, there are 2 or 3 ways to get at that quite practically. One is, to your point, Jennifer, around mandatory training. We are coming up with we are rolling out as we speak or soon anti-racism training as a mandatory part of our compliance training. We completed over the last 6 months a program called 4 Seasons of Reconciliation. It is basically a history lesson on what has happened factually to the Indigenous people of Canada. So mandatory training is critical.
Mhm.
The third, and then I'm going to come back to the second, the third is employee relations groups' mandates need to change. Their job is no longer to just deal with the problem performing employee today. You also have to change their job where they go back over time to look for systemic bias and marginalization that could have occurred that took that employee from a place of hope to hopelessness, from a high producer or performer to a low performer. And so employee relations plays a key role in looking for managers that are not kind or not inclusive or have gaps that we need to coach to. And then the third, or the second, I guess, is the most important, I think, is you got a role model from the CEO down what inclusion dialogues look like. I run a monthly leadership call with 2,000 to 3,000 managers, and I start every one with 15 minutes dedicated to an inclusion discussion. And I'm deliberately covering the Black community, the women's community, the LGBT community. I've had gay people in. I had a white man whose mother committed suicide when he was 24 years old. And so we're covering the spectrum of humanity where these people are sharing their personal stories. And because we're covering the spectrum and they're sharing their story, and I'm interviewing in a way that it's judgment-free, we're role modeling what inclusive leadership looks like. That it's about kindness. It's a curiosity that builds awareness of other human experiences and hopefully builds a shared sense of human empathy over time.
So that's wonderful. There's so many themes here. We need about 6 hours to discuss, but we've landed on some very important ones. You're all from different industries, companies, higher education. What can you learn from other sectors that you could apply in your sector? And where do you think your sector is compared to other sectors? Are you behind? Are you ahead? Are you on a par? So maybe we could start talking about that. How can, for example, corporations learn from higher ed? How can higher ed learn from corporations and so forth? So let's talk about what we can learn from each other.
I've got one that comes to mind. I'm a big fan of Jeannie Rometty from IBM, who has graduated from being their CEO. They did a skills benchmarking exercise at IBM that proved that over time, 70% of the jobs at IBM, a knowledge-based company, could be done with a high school education. So I believe part of the answer to inclusion and social and economic equality is opportunity for education and opportunity for work. Jenny preaches the fact that 70% of her jobs can be done with a high school education, and they deliberately hire from all walks of humanity as a hiring strategy. We as a company, my company, can do better because we still kind of like it when there's an MBA or an HR designation or accounting or a law or accounting designation behind somebody's names. And yes, we will hire those people. But I think there are far more jobs available than we give people credit for.
So I'm going to ask the higher education people, where do you think higher education is, Dr. Sellers, for example? Are we behind, ahead?
I think it depends on the space. I think there's a lot to learn across higher education and the broader corporate world, particularly as it relates to working with employees and staff. But there are fundamental differences between the two areas. So, for instance, most higher ed institutions would shy away from thinking about customers and the relationship with customers. And similarly, I'm not sure that there's anything in the corporate world that compares to faculty and students in terms of the relationships to the organization in the same way. And so they require different approaches and different challenges. I think there's, again, things that we can learn. I'm particularly interested in thinking of ways to more effectively train middle managers, for instance. And for instance, in higher education, you can't even say train as an example of a cultural difference. And providing them with the skills to actually manage diversity is really the way I would frame it, not managing people, but managing the challenges that come up when you have a true, diverse, equitable, and inclusive environment. And most folks don't have those skills. And so I'm always looking to the corporate world to see if there are new ideas and things that can help in that context. On the flip side, I think higher education tends to be held account to societal challenges and problems in ways that the corporate world is perhaps just now being held to account, and even being held to account in the context of the corporate brand as opposed to the corporate's responsibility. So I think those are, in my limited view, some of the nuances between the two sectors and spaces.
James Millman, what is your view about corporations, and Jennifer, in terms of what you might gain from higher ed or vice versa?
Yeah, I'll just say, I think in corporations, at least over the last 3 or 4 years of my career, we've gotten a lot more bold around the conversations and the dialogue that we have within the workplace. Again, there used to be taboo topics that you don't talk about at work, race, religion, and the like. And I think the doors have kind of been blown off of that edict, and the conversations that we bring into the workplace have expanded into what I think are really critical and important topics for us to acknowledge our employees deal with on a day-to-day basis. What I would like to see from I have been surprised based on some of the conversations I run the company's philanthropic efforts as well. And so I get a lot of times investment asks from higher education. And one of the things I'm always surprised by is how often those conversations don't happen on college campuses. And so I think the conversation around these issues needs to be elevated to the student body as well. I mean, it's a great preparatory ground for future employees of our organization to understand these issues when they walk through our door. It should not be the first time they've heard D&I curriculum when they walk into their first corporate job. And so I think, I would love to see higher education take a bolder, more courageous approach to how diversity and inclusion is talked about on campus to all student bodies, not to the students who seek out that education or that concentration or that major, but to the entire student body. So again, that's me with very limited purview. So I don't want my higher ed colleagues to jump on me, but again, I think that's an area of opportunity as again, as we look to a lot of these institutions for our employee base.
Very
And
well
Jen's
said.
letting me know that we have some good questions from the audience that we might want to field.
Yes, so one of the questions I think related to the comments that have already been made from Natasha, what steps should an employee take to push DEI initiatives if you feel your organization could do more, right? So having that sense of fear, how much can I push these issues if it's not being addressed?
I want to call it a chicken and an egg, because I think it also fits with the conversation around higher education. Either the leaders of the institution, whether it's a university or a company, will create the change, or the employees and customers will create the change. You choose. Are you going to wait for your employees or the students to speak up, or are you going to wait, or are you going to take a leadership role in setting the tone? We came out with an updated respectful workplace policy in December. It doesn't talk about you should speak up if you've been marginalized or experienced microaggressions. It basically says you will speak up. You must speak up. And here are your channels of communication. So, we've improved the creation of speak up channels that allow an employee to speak up with as great a sense of psychological safety as possible. But that's not enough. We've now come back at it the other way. So the channels were there, but now we've come at it the other way with a policy that is more clear and overt about speak up, so that we can continue to encourage it, because we're not putting our head in the sand. We know it exists. So my advice to an employee would be to speak up. My advice to HR professionals would be make sure your policies and your speak up channels are best in class.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. So I think many times we encourage employees to speak up, but sometimes they may not feel comfortable because there isn't that psychological safety. So I think in those cases, maybe finding an ally. We've been talking a lot about allies. Finding someone like a manager, an HR business partner, a senior leader that you're really comfortable with, and share the issues with them, because they oftentimes can be that advocate for you when you feel like you've been making these comments a lot and it's just not getting through. I think it's an opportunity to work with those allies, because we do have to recognize that every company, every organization is just not there. And so it may take some time to get to a point where they fully start to embrace some of the ideas and things that you're bringing forward. But I think starting with, if you're feeling like you're not getting through, finding that ally somewhere in the company that you can share that can really speak on your behalf.
That's a good point. Frank Wu has something to add there.
Sure, I'll add two things. One is, it's hard at every level to speak up. I have a fancy title. I'm president of a college, so I'm the chief executive officer. I function within a system. Sometimes I see issues and I want to speak up. And you have to figure out, well, how can I do this effectively as an advocate? How can I make my point something that's aligned with institutional values? Because everyone's aware that, they could be perceived as a troublemaker. No matter how much people talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I know this when I'm on the receiving end. When someone speaks up to me, I remind myself, look, just because I do this doesn't mean that I'm immune or that the institution I had is immune, right? I can't react negatively. I have to really live up to what I say. So I just want to acknowledge just how difficult it is to raise these issues because it makes people uncomfortable. The second thing that I wanted to say is even within the context of diversity, equity, and inclusion, sometimes for different individuals and communities, their claim looks new. So for Asian Americans, for example, because we frame things as black and white, until very recently, I have to say, when I spoke up, it was sort of, well, who are you? You know, there's this model minority myth, you're all doing well anyway, you know, you're sort of horning in on the civil rights movement, you're kind of a Johnny come lately. Sometimes it was explicit, people would just say, you don't have any problems, come on. And there's this perpetual foreigner syndrome, as if I really belong elsewhere. You're doing better than you would be in your homeland, right? As if this isn't my homeland. So it just reproduces that same bias. So I try to remember that, and it's not specific to Asian Americans. In every context, you know, all politics, all culture is local, right? So whatever the power dynamic is someplace else, once you're in that environment, I try to remind myself on my campus, I'm the man, right? So someone might think that because they're not Asian American, that I'm going to be biased toward them. And I just have to put aside whatever is personal to me. So the point is, I want to acknowledge the discomfort. Everyone feels it. And the best thing to do is to find a claim that aligns with what the corporate leaders or your manager or supervisor is already saying, so that the claim you present is one that will advance the interests of the organization.
Very, very well put. I don't know, James Billman, do you have any thoughts on that from your vantage point?
Nothing to add, Edna, sorry.
Okay.
Frank nailed it.
We have another question from the audience. As someone who is not a decision maker within an organization, how can we successfully drive a DEI agenda from the bottom up? So there's some similar questions here, but I think there's a great need that we're seeing that folks want to help, you know, push these issues up to the top.
Yeah, real quick, in a corporate environment, you know, we have employee resource groups. So obviously you've got, you know, kind of CEO leadership, and the management team of the company has to set the vision, set the strategy, make it a critical commitment and a value statement to the organization. But I think employee resource groups are a great way for us to empower our employees, and oftentimes they're newer to the organization, more junior in their career, and they really provide that bottoms up leadership, really expressing the voice and amplifying the voice of our broader community in these respective groups, whether it's LGBTQ or Black or Hispanic or Asian, whatever the case may be. It really allows somebody like me who, you know, typically I'm dealing mostly with senior leadership. It allows me to really understand what's going on within the organization. So I think the bottoms up leadership on DEI, and I wouldn't even say leadership, it's really amplifying the voices of our employee population. Our employee resource groups do a really, really great job of that, really critical aspect of any successful diversity inclusion program.
Go ahead, Dr. Sellers.
So I guess I'm a little bit concerned about the direction of our conversation too, in terms of opportunities. So we've spent a lot of time talking about interpersonal responses to potential structural changes. So in the last two questions, they're clearly underlying this as issues of power and the lack of power. And if we're really interested in making structural changes, that also means, are we willing to shake up the institutions in such a way that it redistributes power? Diversity, one of our challenges with regards to people having problems with the definitions of diversity is it often sounds like we're just rearranging the chairs without actually changing the direction of the ship, the boat, et cetera. And fundamentally, if we really are talking about inclusion, we're fundamentally talking about changes in power dynamics. And so Are we willing as an institution to actually change? We spent a lot of time talking about changing individuals, training our managers, making sure that our leaders are saying the right things, but are we actually putting in place real changes into the structure of our organization and looking at the extent to which the structure of our organizations are fundamentally oppressive? And to what extent are we willing to make those changes as an institution, which is one of the most difficult aspects of being a chief diversity officer, is are you willing to put forth efforts that will change the hand that has fed us, that has also allowed us to rise on personal levels and to really benefit from the system. So as an African-American man, I have benefited from the system that I'm in. I am not in the situation of most people from my class, from my race, from my space. And so to what extent am I willing to challenge or bite the hand that feeds me is really, I think, the fundamental challenge that we all face in our positions.
I love that. I love that, Robert. Well, I think we ultimately, you know, the answer is we have to challenge those biases. And whether policymakers, Europe is a good example where policymakers are coming out quite strong with female representation or diversity representation on boards or in senior management. So policymakers will either drive it as society becomes more diverse. It already is diverse. That's the illusion. Or the CEO needs to create it and build the talent over time that can take on these bigger jobs and create a richer conversation and a richer set of ideas at the most senior levels and a more inclusive culture. And we just did a loan. I'll give you an example. We just did a very large loan to a very large energy company that is called an environmental social governance backed loan. And the pricing of that loan is tied to to a series of diversity metrics for the senior management team and the board of directors of that company. So they will get a better credit rating, they will get a better price on the loan because they will achieve these inclusion and diversity metrics for their senior executive and for their board of directors. So there are changes happening that will hold the world accountable to higher levels of social and economic inclusion, including representations across the power structure. I think we need, back to the speak up question, I think we need to continue to encourage our employees to speak up and push us, because there is a natural gravity, to your point, Robert, where human nature will be to slide backwards out of fear of being marginalized, and we don't want them to do that.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point because, you know, we talked a lot about, you know, the culture and building allies and advocates and things of that nature. But I think we also have to ensure that we have the right systems in place that support where we're trying to go in our D&I journey. So that means looking at the entire employee life cycle, the way we recruit, the way we retain, development, promotion, et cetera, and making sure that we're de-biasing those processes, because if we take a close look, many of us will find that there's bias that plays out along the way in all those different processes. So one of the things that we did at Thermo Fisher is, as we looked at our recruitment process, we were trying to figure out, you know, we were going to all these diversity conferences and seeing all this great talent, but they weren't moving through the applicant process. And so we wanted to understand what was the issue. And so what we found is that many people were falling out at the resume review process. Why was that happening? Well, that was happening for a couple of reasons. One, because we tend to like people within our industry. right? And so we were losing a lot of talent because of that, because they were not part of the, technology, life sciences industry. The other piece was, people asking for qualifications that were really on their wish list, not necessarily basic qualifications, they were preferred qualifications. And so losing a lot of great talent because of the way job requisitions are written. And so we had to take a really close look at that process and say, look, we're losing a lot of great diverse talent because of our recruitment system. And so one of the things that we decided to do was, one, put some standardization around job requisitions so that it helps to eliminate that bias. Two, bring in the technology. One of the things that we did is we purchased the licensing to a software called Textio, which scans your job requisition and highlights areas within that requisition where it may have bias. And so then it encourages you to say, for example, if it highlights a word and maybe it's doesn't have the right gender inclusive language, it will tell you, this is what you might need to change. And this, if you change this is the likelihood that you'll be able to attract a diverse candidate. And so putting some of those measures in place really helped us improve our overall recruitment process. And so it's something that we're still working on right now, but that's been really well received because, we wanted to know what's happening here. We're putting a lot of time and effort into the attraction process, but something is actually happening here. And so I think that's what we have to do with many of our systems, is really take a close look and see where those opportunities are and really making sure that we are debiasing those processes so that everyone has a fair chance.
So we've talked about systems and change, and that's so important in power. These are the sort of the unnamed elephant in the room, that we can't just change behavior, as Dr. Sellers was saying, we have to change systems. We have to change structures to make real progress, and we have to empower and share power, the most difficult thing of all to share, as we know. People don't want to let go of power. We have time for one question that is really a burning question that's on the mind of all of us, which is, if you had to give one piece of advice for leaders in advancing diversity, what would that be? And I'd like to go around the room and have each person weigh in a sort of rapid fire way on that one piece of advice. So just in a couple of quick sentences, if we could have each person weigh in, what is your piece of advice to diversity leaders who are trying to get diversity going in these structural, systemic ways? Go ahead.
I'll go. The most important briefs filed in the University of Michigan affirmative action case were the brief by corporate leaders, Fortune 500 CEOs, and by military leaders, generals and admirals. Those briefs, while they did talk about principles and civil rights, made a very simple point. This is in the national self-interest. In order to be competitive, you can't leave behind a segment of the population. So the most effective message to people is a straight up appeal to them. Look, if you're going to be competitive globally, if your company's going to succeed, your university, if you don't embrace diversity, you're just going to be left behind. Whether you believe in it or not, the world is going to change around you.
Great advice.
The part that I would add to Frank, so I agree totally with Frank. The one I would add is, you have bias. It starts with the fact that every one of us as human beings have things that were conditioned into us through our early life experiences that become filters, that cause us to look at things through a worldview that is just our worldview. So conditioning leaders early on in their career to understand that they have bias, and creating a culture where it's rewarded for challenging that bias.
Thank you. Great advice.
And now I'll jump in. I think there's nothing that beats modeling. I think people look to leadership for what they do implicitly and explicitly, verbally and non-verbally. And I think that speaks volumes to employees across an organization or students and faculty across the
Mhm.
school.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And
James or Albert?
I would say be accountable, because we can have all the tools and systems that we want, but we want to have, but if we're not accountable for the change that we want to see, I think it's all in vain.
Be accountable, absolutely.
Yeah, everyone's mentioned ones that I would have taken, but I'll say be courageous. Again, this work's not easy. You are going to have to have the intestinal fortitude to put yourself out there in uncomfortable circumstances. And so I think for a leader, being courageous is important.
Very important. Intestinal fortitude. Let's hear it for that. Dr. Sellers, did you?
I would say be strategic, understanding how things work and how you can make change that is long lasting, that is beyond symbolic, that is also going to be scary because it may lead you to a place that you.
Accountable, courageous, bias, the larger interests of, that you'll be left behind. These are all incredibly important, and leadership, of course, that Dr. Saffier has added. So these are all wonderful pieces of advice for our students and for our participants tonight. We want to thank our participants in the panel for their wonderful contributions and for their sharing their expertise with us from across the country and taking the time to be with us tonight, and all the wonderful questions that we've gotten from our audience as well. So I don't know, Dr. Saffier, if you wanted to close.
Edna, I wanted to thank you and thank our colleagues and thank Jen. I think this was a robust conversation. It's cliche to say that we could go for another couple hours, but I know in New Jersey, at least, it's 8 o'clock. I'm kind of ready to sign off. But thank you all. It's such a critical time for us. And I was heartened at the beginning and continue to be so when I heard that this time may be different. So let's all put our shoulders against that and push for that. And, I think Frank said it as well. It's a process, right? It's not going to be a flash cut. So we all have to commit to that and work to that. And I want to thank you all for giving your time. Thank the audience for joining. Let people know that there'll be a video available of this. We'll push out, and encourage you to stay engaged with us. Stay engaged. Follow us on LinkedIn. We'll continue to have conversations like this and events like this. So Dr. Edna Chun, our colleagues, everyone, thank you very, very much. And audience, thank you.
Thank you.